Just pausing for a moment here as people settle into their Zoom boxes, and we'll get going here in just momentarily. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Jeff Katzman. I'm the Director of Education at Silver Hill Hospital and the director of our new initiative, the Silver Hill Academy for Research and Education, that we're calling SHARE. And we are absolutely delighted to have you join us today and are privileged, really privileged, to welcome Dr. Lawrence Fishman, who will be presenting on the topic of illusion-disillusionment, a Winicottian framework for psychedelic-assisted therapy. Some housekeeping first. Our next grand rounds takes place on June 11th with Dr. Michael Gitlin, who spoke to us before about suicide and suicide assessment, and who will be coming back to us as our invitation and is going to speak to us about the pharmacotherapy of personality disorders. So please join us to hear Dr. Gitlin on June 11th. To see all our Silver Hill Share events, visit silverhillhospital.org/calendar. And back to today's lecture. Your questions, as always, are really an important part of our grand rounds, and I will moderate a Q&A discussion with Dr. Fishman at the end of his lecture. This is really a great opportunity to put forward questions and comments to Dr. Fishman, which you can submit anytime during the lecture by using the Q&A link. And again, advise everybody to make those questions conceptual and not about specific patients or personal experiences necessarily, because those are more difficult to share with a larger audience. If you would like CME or CEU credits today, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in your browser when we end the webinar. A link to the survey will also be emailed to all participants tomorrow. And note that this email will be a Zoom email coming from SHH Events. The email will also contain a link to the recording and slide presentation. So that all participants have enough time to complete the survey, it will remain open to the end of the day on Friday, and certificates will then be mailed within a week. Any questions about that, please contact us at shhevents@silverhillhospital.org. And finally, disclosures. No planners of this activity have indicated a relevant financial relationship with an ACCME defined commercial interest. And Dr. Fishman will share a slide with his disclosures. It really is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Lawrence Fishman, who I've had the joy to talk to a couple of times, and it's been a real pleasure. And thank you in advance, Dr. Fishman, for speaking to us today. Dr. Fishman is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who practiced in New York and Maine for many years. In addition to his full-time private practice, he was a clinical instructor in psychiatry at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center and later at Tufts University of Medicine's main track, where he still serves on the admissions subcommittee. In 1983, he published a paper comparing psychedelic drug states with dreams and psychosis in Schizophrenia Bulletin. He retired from practice in 2021 to devote more time to reading and writing about psychoanalytic perspectives on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. He enjoys living in Maine and is excited by the emerging possibilities for integrating psychedelic experiences with psychoanalytically based psychotherapy. For me, I must say it's been really a joy getting to know Dr. Fishman through our conversation and learning about actually his post-retirement jobs, including a bakery and gardening, and those have been really fascinating conversations. But just today, I learned Dr. Fishman is now a professional ice cream flavor consultant, responsible for developing and tasting new flavors of ice cream for a local store. He spends times in restaurants wondering how to develop flavors based at times on what he runs into in restaurants. And we even discussed the conversion of the craze of Dubai chocolates into ice cream that can mirror the flavor. So if you have a great idea for an ice cream, in addition to putting questions in the chat, feel free to put that in the chat as well, and I'll get a tally of those and get those to Dr. Fishman for potential development. And with that, I say a big thank you again, Lawrence, for joining us, for sharing really this important information and for sharing the space with us today.
You're very welcome, and thank you for that great introduction, Jeff. And I am looking forward to your questions and flavor suggestions. And should you wind up in the Portland, Maine area sometime this summer, please come by Willard Scoops and taste some of our new flavors. And if you come up with some good suggestions, you might be surprised to see your own flavor in there. So, um, the title of my talk today, as Jeff mentioned, is called Illusion-Disillusionment. That's a Winnicott term, a Winicottian framework for psychedelic-assisted therapy. And the way this presentation is going to go is I'm going to present first some kind of theoretical background, and then I'm going to have two and sort of a third clinical vignette, which will illustrate some of the principles that we're talking about. So in full disclosure, in compliance with the ACCME standards, I do not have any relevant financial relationships to disclose in relation to this presentation. So as I say in the caption here, that is not me in the photo. Here are our educational objectives for today. I hope that by the end of the talk, you'll be able to describe what Winnicott meant by the need in healthy development to allow for illusion-disillusionment and how this can be translated into a clinical attitude towards entertaining transpersonal experiences in therapy. Also, you'll be able to describe the caregiver's role in mediating the tension between what we're going to refer to as continuity of being and falling to pieces during infancy, and how this bears on the therapist's role in mediating transpersonal experiences during psychedelic-assisted therapy. And then lastly, and this will come in towards the end of the talk, discuss when it would be risky to implement an illusion-disillusionment approach to experiences arising under psychedelic drugs, and what the concept of double entry bookkeeping means. Bursting the bubble is a phrase most often used in economic discussions, but it has been applied also to other situations in which the shattering of an illusion or overly optimistic expectations is a distinct possibility. The phrase, bursting the bubble, has been applied to the recent renaissance in psychedelic-assisted therapy, mainly because of the explosive media hype surrounding all of the very positive research findings about this treatment. In a sense, the bubble has already burst when the FDA declined to approve the Lykos application for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, citing a need for further evidence to support what it takes to be still unproven claims for efficacy. But there may be other reasons that this metaphor, bursting the bubble, applies to psychedelic-assisted therapy. With psychedelic-induced ego dissolution, profound mystical experiences may occur, which engender new insights and beliefs that are often at odds with conventional thinking. These may range from changed ideas about nature, God, life and death, or about consciousness itself, to inflated ideas about one's personal capacities, recollections of one's birth process, so-called past lives, and previously unremembered stories about childhood abuse. How should these ideas be addressed in the treatment setting? I suggest thinking about these experiences as what Winnicott called transitional phenomenon. This means that beliefs which arise from psychedelic experiences are regarded in the same way that a parent holds a child's transitional object, a process which Winnicott termed illusion-disillusionment. By adopting the same attitude towards the patient's experience that an attuned parent adopts towards her child's transitional object, the psychedelic-assisted therapist remains agnostic regarding the objective reality of the patient's experience. When this attitude is born from both curiosity as well as compassionate concern, rather than just an evasion of an uncomfortable choice, the stage is set for the patient to explore her beliefs both privately and aloud without external pressure. This renders less threatening for both parties the looming threat of the therapist bursting the bubble, or what otherwise might be experienced as a jarring deflationary process. You might object that in adopting this term, illusion-disillusionment, I am already betraying a biased view of the patient's experience as a fantasy. And therefore, in accepting the patient's experience, a therapist is acting disingenuously in a way that may cultivate distrust. To clarify, I use this term, illusion-disillusionment, to refer to an ongoing process of subjecting one's current beliefs to newer, more encompassing sensory evidence, as articulated in Friston's free energy principle. In this sense, it is assumed that all beliefs are illusions or best guesses, predictions, which are forever being revised in a way that is ostensibly more accurate. Extending this to the psychedelic therapy setting, a therapist who approaches the patient with an illusion-disillusionment orientation cultivates the same approach in working with the patient's experience that he or she applies towards her or his own subjectivity. The issue is not whether initial illusion will eventually yield to disillusionment, but the manner in which these beliefs are revised. In what follows, I will discuss how an illusion-disillusionment approach to psychedelic-assisted therapy is well suited for navigating some thorny issues that have been justifiably raised by some critics of this therapy, including some potentially adverse treatment outcomes. I will also discuss what I call a mode of experiencing during psychedelic-induced ego dissolution, and I will differentiate this mode of experiencing from the insights or ideas generated through this mode. My discussion will cross paths in several places with the interesting life of William James. Nowhere in psychedelic-assisted therapy is the issue of bursting the bubble more sensitive and controversial than in referring to transpersonal experiences. This term was coined by William James in 1905. While teaching a philosophy course, James was defending phenomenalism or idealism from accusations that it denies the objective import of experience. He said, quote, "It is important in discussion to disentangle certain ambiguities in the word objective as used here. That an idea represents an object may mean that it represents something either, one, transpersonal, as when my object is also your object, or, and he goes on from there. A pretty straightforward definition, when my object is also your object, or when we both have the same thing in mind. That this term, transpersonal, was later expanded to represent a wide range of non-ordinary experiences, like Groff's definition here on the slide, and that James is now viewed as one of the fathers of transpersonal psychology speaks to the unique way James approached the phenomena that appear to defy scientific explanation. His intense interest in these phenomena and his epistemic struggle with them are why I turn to William James today in talking about how to approach non-ordinary psychedelic experiences. On the slide is his most often cited quotation, which I'll read aloud because I like it so much. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, while all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. James was fascinated by religion and by the supernatural, and brought the same empirical, pragmatic approach to the investigation of religious, mystical, and supernatural phenomena as he brought to the study of psychology and philosophy. His attitude was at the same time both open and skeptical, emphasizing the need to accumulate data, but to reserve interpretation. He attended seances and believed that, and this is a quote, mediums sometimes revealed knowledge that they could not have known in their ordinary states of consciousness. He recognized that this field was rife with charlatans and with fraud, but as he wrote in a letter, I believe there is no source of deception in the investigation of nature which can compare with a fixed belief that certain kinds of phenomena are impossible. I like that. However, his interest in seances and the like subjected him to ridicule in many academic communities. Interestingly, James clung to his interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness despite this ridicule and despite his own grounding in anatomy, physiology, and philosophical pragmatism. William James actually went to medical school. One theory is that he needed to believe in, quote, something more to preserve his own mental health, especially when his philosophical leanings drove him to despair that human beings had no free will. James's conflict about his own faith was reflected in his emotional investment in the spiritual vacillations of his cousin, Minnie Temple, pictured here in the slide, as she was dying. She died quite young. James's charismatic father, who is Minnie's Uncle Henry, managed to convert Minnie briefly to Orthodox Christianity just before her death. But before she died, she returned to her more congenial paganism. Minnie wrote, and this is a quote from a letter of Minnie Temple shortly before her death, and it's about paganism. One at least feels that here one breathes one's native air. Welcome back the old human feeling with its beautiful pride and its striving, its despair, its mystery, and its faith. James, William James, must have envied Minnie's acceptance and abiding faith in the human condition, and in renouncing what ultimately felt to her like illusion, that is, the Orthodox Christianity that her uncle briefly converted her to, even as she faced her own death. William James's own despair, further aggravated by Minnie's death, and we'll discuss more about this later, helped him recognize a dynamic relationship between his own need for faith and his sense of powerlessness over his own fate. So I entitled this slide Winnicott on Illusion-Disillusionment. And this slide, in a way, is the crux of what I'm saying. So I'm going to read it aloud. And this is a quote from Winnicott. The mother, at the beginning, by an almost 100% adaptation, affords the infant the opportunity for the illusion that her breast is part of the infant. It is, as it were, under the baby's magical control. The mother's eventual task is gradually to disillusion the infant, but she has no hope of success unless at first she has been able to give sufficient opportunity for illusion. So this process, which Winnicott called illusion-disillusionment, begins with the mother initially encouraging, but later discouraging what he calls the infant's sense of omnipotence. Only after allowing a significant period of omnipotence or illusion can successful adaptation to the strain of reality, i.e., disillusionment, take place. This converges with William James's observation that one's need for belief arises from one's sense of powerlessness over fate. The fact that we are actually able to control certain things in our lives hardly matters. The key point here is simply that a dynamic relationship exists between one's need for belief and the sense of power or control one has or doesn't have over one's own objects. For Winnicott, the infant's omnipotence is preceded by an earlier developmental phase, which he called absolute dependency, in which, and I'll read the quote here, maternal care enables the infant to live and develop in spite of his not being yet able to control or to feel responsible for what is good and bad in the environment. So good enough maternal care, Winnicott's term for this is holding, enables the infant gradually to, quote, gather external factors into the area of the infant's omnipotence, where they are, quote, sensed as projections. Winnicott adds here, the paradox is that what is good and bad in the infant's environment is in fact not a projection. But in spite of this, it is necessary, if the individual infant is to develop healthily, that everything shall seem to him to be a projection. This is what Winnicott means in referring to omnipotence as an illusion. This developmental idea of the mother implementing, that's a word we'll talk about, implementing a significant period of infantile omnipotence before allowing gradual disillusionment to take place, also informed Winnicott's clinical work with adults. Winnicott came to believe that patients in psychoanalysis only benefit from interpretation when, quote, the traumatic factors enter the psychoanalytic material in the patient's own way and within the patient's omnipotence. As the second quote in the slide over here reveals, and I'll read it. It took Winnicott himself a long time to realize this. It is only in recent years that I have become able to wait and wait for the natural evolution of the transference arising out of the patient's growing trust in the psychoanalytic technique and setting, and to avoid breaking up this natural process by making interpretations. It appalls me to think how much deep change I have prevented or delayed in patients in a certain classification by my personal need to interpret. And he added to this, if only we can wait, the patient arrives at understanding creatively and with immense joy. And I now enjoy this joy more than I used to enjoy the sense of having been clever, i.e., by making clever interpretations. This last statement lays bare the implicit link that Winnicott makes between the sense of omnipotence and creativity. And it may be taken also as a prescription of technique for the psychedelic therapist. Winnicott's formulation, following Freud, of the infant's experiencing the breast's arrival at the time of need as a hallucinatory satisfaction of a wish, and therefore as a manifestation of the infant's omnipotence, strikes me as a bit forced. And it is also at odds with the observations of later infant mother dyad research, which shows that infants are remarkably adept and accurate reality testers. If we apply Kohut's self-psychology model, the area of omnipotence, which is in need of gradual surrender, is not the infant's own sense of omnipotence, which is a questionable attribution in the first place, but what Kohut called the idealized parental imago, or the infant's sense of the object's omnipotence. This slight modification brings us to the developmental origins of awe. Awe is a hallmark of psychedelic-induced mystical experience and a component of self-transcendent experiences in general. It has been defined as a feeling of smallness within vastness, a definition which I like a lot. I discuss it here as a prototype or core component of psychedelic-induced transpersonal experiences that I suggest are best managed using an illusion-disillusionment approach. Keltner and Haidt argue that the primordial form of awe is awe felt towards powerful others. It is quite tempting to imagine that such an experience has roots in the infant's absolute dependency within the infant-mother dyad. Being and annihilation This is Winnicott's description of the infant's state of consciousness during the stage he calls absolute dependency. In this place, which is characterized by the essential existence of a holding environment, the inherited potential is becoming itself a continuity of being. The alternative to being is reacting, and reacting interrupts being and annihilates. Being and annihilation are the two alternatives. The function of the holding environment is to minimize reacting to so-called impingements that disrupt the infant's continuity of being. With repeated returns to being from annihilation, the infant, quote, begins to develop the sophistications which make it possible for impingements to be gathered into the area of omnipotence. But here again is why I suggest that the tiny infant experiences omnipotence as residing in the powerful other who restores her continuity of being, not in herself. For an adult, the feeling of awe or smallness within vastness may evoke the early drama of being on the verge of annihilation and somehow through the intervention of a powerful other resuming a continuity of being. Traces of this can be found in many experiences of awe. During psychedelic-induced ego dissolution, the subject, lacking ego defenses, or in Winnicott's developmental terms, lacking the capacity to manage impingement, sits again on the precipice of annihilation. In this slide are some quotes, some descriptions of awe experienced by people who were on psychedelics. Someone named Noah said, and I remember just kind of dissolving, like getting burst and disintegrating and dying and then coming back. And there, at that point, I had this like feeling of love. And I was in this beautiful, it was hard to describe. It was like a beautiful scene. And I had this, I guess that was when I had the awe experience of feeling loved. And another description. I didn't realize I was in my body anymore and was just in a combination of immense love, immense fear, tears flowing down my eyes, almost not blinking while looking at whatever I was seeing with opened eye visuals. But I felt both nothing and everything. I felt both timeless and eternal, but at the same time that I'm just a speck and I never existed. It was, yeah, a deeply awe-inspiring and spiritual experience. So these experiences reflect a heightening of the tension between continuity of being and annihilation, which often marks such states. While awe usually refers nowadays to positively valenced affects, this reflects a fairly recent change in usage away from its original meaning and etymology, which connotes a feeling of fear or terror. Researchers on awe note that it can tilt either towards elation and beauty on one pole or towards terror on the other, which may be why psychedelic experiences can be both terrifying and or enlightening. The heightening of tension between continuity of being and annihilation, and these are Winnicott's terms, which are a little clumsy, but I am faithful to them throughout this presentation. So the heightening of tension between continuity of being and annihilation, which underlies the tension we discussed earlier between omnipotence and powerlessness, may explain the critical need for illusion during and after psychedelic-induced states and transpersonal phenomena in general. In the same way that holding, by allowing, quote, sufficient opportunity for illusion, supports the infant's continuity of being in the face of threatened annihilation, so in psychedelic-induced states, the therapist's implementation of illusion is made necessary by the proximity of threat, which brings us back to our bubble metaphor. What exactly does it mean to implement the subject's illusion in psychedelic-assisted therapy? Here is Winnicott's description of the true self. A true self begins to have life through the strength given to the infant's weak ego by the mother's implementation of the infant's omnipotent expressions. So Winnicott used the term implement to describe how an empathically intuned or so-called good enough mother responds to what he calls the infant's omnipotent expressions. She implements them. The mother's adaptation is good enough, and in consequence, the infant begins to believe in external reality, which appears and behaves as by magic because of the mother's relatively successful adaptation to the infant's gestures and needs, and which acts in a way that does not clash with the infant's omnipotence. On this basis, the infant can gradually abrogate omnipotence. So the magic, so-called magic, lies in the mother's adaptation to the infant's gesture or the infant's signal of need. This allows the infant to believe in external reality, which is a startling phrase that Winnicott uses here. The infant's acceptance of external reality isn't a given, it's a belief. That's an extraordinary idea. A belief in external reality, a faith that comes to life through the mother's implementation of the infant's expression of need. Where Winnicott sees omnipotence or magical control in the infant's subjective experience of this interaction, subsequent research using video microanalysis of mother-infant interaction reveals that this so-called magical control takes place in real time through affective signals, or Winnicott's so-called gesture, and in contingent responses to these affective signals. To appreciate this idea of what implementation does in the way of helping the infant to live on the brink, bear in mind that Winnicott's infant is all the time on the brink of what he calls unthinkable anxiety, which is going to pieces, falling forever, having no relationship to the body, having no orientation. Annihilation is part of the infant's reality. Repeated rescues from the brink allow the infant to believe in a reality in which impingements need not mean annihilation, a reality in which the infant's signal or gesture leads to a continuity of being. I think this is what Winnicott means in saying that the mother's successful adaptation enables the infant to believe in external reality. What coincides with her belief in external reality is a sense of her own reality, which Winnicott called her true self, which, as we saw in the last slide, begins to have life through the mother's implementation of the infant's gesture. Winnicott's startling phrase, believe in external reality, allows us to consider what might be called a mode of experiencing. In his paper about the true self, he discusses two selves, one that feels real and one that doesn't. The spontaneous gesture is the true self in action. Only the true self can be creative, and only the true self can feel real. Whereas a true self feels real, the existence of a false self results in a feeling unreal or a sense of futility. When Winnicott discusses how, through the mother's repeatedly good enough adaptation to the infant's gesture, the infant's true self begins to have life, and the infant begins to believe in external reality, he's describing a quality, a sense, an existential feeling about the infant's experience. This idea, this true self, is not some abstract, guarded aspect of one's identity, but something lived, something actively experienced. I suggest understanding it as a mode of experience to which the words real and believe both apply. When Winnicott specifies that the mother acts in a way that does not clash with the infant's omnipotence, he's referring to the mother's recognition of the importance to the infant of what the infant believes. Whether or not this is illusion is immaterial. In the psychedelic assisted therapy situation, belief also plays a critical role. In applying Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to this setting, it's essential that the therapist act in a way which doesn't clash with the psychedelic subject's belief. To paraphrase Winnicott's observation of the good enough mother, it is on this basis that the psychedelic subject can gradually abrogate illusion. This is really the essence of applying Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to the psychedelic-assisted therapy situation. The therapist remains agnostic regarding the content of the psychedelic subject's belief. She may need to wait a very long time to be able to interpret what the belief means or where it comes from. In the meantime, she must continue through a good enough adaptation to the subject's various gestures to cultivate a therapeutic setting in which the mode of experiencing can feel real. Winnicott applied this illusion-disillusionment approach to the transitional object. In order to start each human being off with what will always be important to them, i.e., a neutral area of experience which will not be challenged, he suggested the following rule. And this is what's in the slide here. Of the transitional object, it can be said that it is a matter of agreement between us and the baby that we will never ask the question, did you conceive of this or was it presented to you from without? The important point is that no decision on this point is expected. The question is not to be formulated. In applying this rule to psychedelic-assisted therapy, the therapist never questions whether the subject has created her belief or found it existing outside within external reality. In simply wanting to know more, the therapist promotes a mode of experiencing in which that which has been created can feel real. Nurturing this mode of experiencing enables meaningful transformation. On this slide, here is Winnicott on how play or creativity gives rise to the true self and why it is critical to cultivate in therapy, and particularly in psychedelic-assisted therapy, this so-called mode of experiencing, which I described earlier, to which the words believe and real apply. So just reading this aloud quickly. It is in playing and only in playing that the individual child or adult is able to be creative and to use the whole personality. And it is only in being creative that the individual discovers the self. So I'm now going to move on to the clinical vignettes. And I'm using initials to refer to people here, in case that gets a little weird. A 31-year-old man, D, told me about an experience he had had 11 years earlier while on LSD. At that time, D was living with a couple of roommates, and much of the time with a young woman, O, whom he had fallen in love with, but who was also in a relationship with a man who lived elsewhere. Things did not work out for D in college, so he withdrew and felt very uncertain about what he was going to do with his life. He took LSD spontaneously one day, along with some friends, including O. The trip became quite intense, especially when one of his male friends, who also had eyes for O, lay next to O on a bed. Sensing D's jealousy, his friend offered to switch places with D, which D gladly accepted. While he was lying on the bed next to O and listening to music, D began rhythmically stroking a hanging rug draped along the slanted ceiling over the bed. Both D and O were mesmerized by the undulations in the rug caused by D's stroking and by a mandala pattern in its center from which a pattern of flower petals radiated outward. At one point, With a feeling of sensual energy building up, Dee placed 4 fingers through a hole in the rug. At that moment, it seemed to Dee that O exploded into orgasm, and that he himself felt something like an orgasm, though without ejaculation. Crucially, neither Dee nor O verbalized anything to each other about what they were experiencing. The trip lasted throughout the night, culminating the next morning when someone drew aside a curtain to reveal a world unexpectedly changed, blanketed in glistening snow. The group of friends walked towards a promontory overlooking the town. As he surveyed the town's inhabitants going off to work and daily chores, Dee had a novel and somewhat superior sense of, I know, though he could not have said exactly what it was that he knew. A few months later, Dee saw O for the first time since their LSD trip. That night, the apartment lights mysteriously flickered on and off just when Dee was thinking about their magical moment together and the bursting love he felt for O. Once again, neither party said anything to the other about their feelings. The next morning, O told Dee that the severe leg pain she had been having the night before had vanished. Dee took this and the flickering lights as confirmation of the powerful reciprocal love he imagined that they felt for each other. This was the last they would see of each other for many, many years, as Dee felt compelled by circumstances to move back to the town where his parents lived. Dee felt that something quite remarkable had changed in him as a result of this LSD trip, a feeling which was accentuated by the glistening snow cover, which had totally transformed the world around him, and the light flickering encounter, which seemed to have magically cured O's leg pain. When he again ran into O many, many years later, he finally asked her what she had experienced during the night of their LSD trip. She confided that she had indeed experienced an orgasm that night. Their conversation generally confirmed what Dee had long felt about their connection. In the intervening years, Dee went into psychotherapy and avidly studied philosophy and religion. He thought often about his LSD experience, which was structured in a way to help him. Oh, I'm sorry. He thought often about his LSD experience and what it signified. He welcomed my questions about his LSD experience, which were structured in a way to help him understand what it meant to him, rather than trying to place it within some kind of explanatory framework. We discussed what it meant to him to believe that O had had an orgasm when he put his fingers through the hole in the rug. Her orgasm signified that she welcomed his love, that it affected her powerfully, meant something very dear to her. The same held true for his wishful thinking the night that the lights flickered. He noted that the energy with which he threw himself into his endeavors following this LSD trip had something of a manic quality to it. He wondered if this manic quality reflected some kind of compensatory effort on his part. It cast his professional career as an outgrowth of what the sensuous rug episode symbolized, an engrossing need to believe that he could meaningfully affect the lives of others. This clarification of his feelings about his non-ordinary experience helped Dee arrive at a narrative about his life that made sense to him without our addressing the nature of the energy or forces that may or may not have been at work during these events. The course of time which elapsed between Dee's LSD trip and his many years later conversation with O had allowed Dee to work through his illusion himself, preparing him well for some eventual disillusionment. It was reassuring to know that O actually had had an orgasm, but it was no longer critical for Dee to believe that their feelings for each other were powerful enough to cause the lights to flicker and to take away her leg pain. So this is a second clinical vignette, and I'll warn you that it's a little bit difficult to keep track of the different generations of family involved in here. So try to stay focused on that. A 39-year-old man named S mentioned a transformative experience he had had 4 years earlier while on MDMA. This took place in an underground therapeutic setting in the home of the guide/therapist. S had recently been given new academic responsibilities and was experiencing some performance anxiety, which he hoped to control better. As the MDMA took effect, S had a vision of his infant daughter. He powerfully felt his love for her and her love for him. Suddenly, he was looking instead at his mother and then at his mother's father, both of whom quickly, quote, blinked past before, quote, strangely, he, quote, got to meet my maternal great-grandfather, who we'll call W. W had rarely even been talked about in S's family. This so-called meeting took place, that is the meeting during his MDMA experience. The meeting took place in Eastern Europe. In other words, that was the imagined background, where W, the great-grandfather, and his young family had lived before the Soviet invasion, which precipitated their departure from Eastern Europe. In this meeting, S and W discussed why W had pushed W's son so hard to, quote, be someone in the academic world. This was a topic S had never even thought about before, though in his psychotherapy, S had spent a lot of time thinking about why his grandfather, in other words, W's younger son, left his wife and children, including S's mother. So W is the great-grandfather, W's son is the maternal grandfather, and then we're also talking about S's mother, who was abandoned by W's son. This meeting on MDMA helped S imagine that W displaced his own unfulfilled ambitions, which were crushed by the Soviet invasion, onto his son, who thus felt conflicted between trying to please his father and living his own life. Depicting his grandfather's predicament in these human terms allowed S to sympathize with his grandfather, whose decision to leave his family had caused S's grandmother and S's mother great pain. S had always harbored, and I quote from him, skepticism about paranormal explanations, spiritual explanations. And he was very much taken aback by this vision under MDMA, which instantly, quote, shifted my overall sense of what a human mind can do. It allowed him to feel, and I quote, being one with his ancestors, and to feel W, quote, inside my heart. This vision came to him at a point where he recognized how much he loved his young daughter, and at a point in his career when his responsibilities weighed on him. As he shared this with me, he imagined how pressured his grandfather must have felt with young children and demands for academic success. He recognized in his grandfather's life a, quote, parallel universe in which he, quote, unconsciously still lives. This parallel universe was dominated by the terror, that's S's word, of feeling responsible for keeping his suicidal mother alive. His vision brought him a new narrative, and with it, compassion for W and also for his grandfather. It allowed S to feel some compassion as well for himself, to accept that while he might not be a superhero, there is much he can do, and that his presence alone is important to others. He is very grateful that he sought psychotherapeutic help, which encouraged him to return to his family of origin after fleeing from them earlier in his life. He feels sad for his grandfather, who never got help, did not return to his family, and became alcoholic. He wishes he could have gotten to know his grandfather. Unlike his grandfather, S has used the knowledge gained through his transgenerational connection, that is, through this MDMA trip, both to love and to fight his own parents in a way that allows him to be himself. In a more recent psychedelic therapy retreat, this time on ayahuasca, S so-called met his grandfather. In other words, had another kind of vision. And he asked his grandfather why he left his family. His grandfather began, quote, "He told me that he was a pedophile, and he told me that he didn't know how to be close to my mother without being scared that he would hurt her." As S recalled this meeting in his conversation with me, it came back to life. And I quote S here. "I remember we had a struggle where I was not wanting to be close to him. And then eventually I came to a moment of forgiveness. It was like both. It was a moment of letting go, of saying goodbye. And then when I had said goodbye, then I could forgive him. I remember telling him, no matter what you did, I love you. No matter what happened, no matter who you are, you have a place in my heart." It's interesting because the way my mind has this memory, I have this shift where first he looks very stubborn and depressed and harsh in his face. And then after the forgiving piece, then it's like he's finally being able to rest. It's like I have a sense that at first he's hovering over me like a threat or like some kind of demon. And then he kind of comes to a rest and in a way disappears or falls into the background. So as S is relating this to me, I asked him, when he was hovering over you like a demon, how did you feel? And S said, "When you ask, I think I had already begun to feel relief after a few hours of experiencing myself as this monster, this aggressive sexual monster that has to be imprisoned and has to be controlled. Because if I'm not under full control, then I'm going to lash out. I'm going to kill people or rape people." So I had this huge, what's the word, this identification happen where I felt like I was 100% embodying the pedophile part. And I was letting the pedophile part. Oh, and I was the pedophile part. And I was really paranoid about letting other people in the room know where I was going and what I was struggling with. And then slowly but steadily, I managed to find myself in all of that and separate from this part. At this point, he tells me that a new image has just come to his mind. And here's this new image. I was at the retreat and I went to the bathroom and I sat down and I had this massive, massive breakthrough of grief because in my mind's eye, I had my kids there. But for the first time, I had no anxiety about being naked in their presence. This was like I had the sense, like consciously for the first time at least, that nothing bad is going to happen. It's okay. That was completely unconscious up until this moment. After a pause, I shared a personal anecdote about physical closeness with children. S then mentioned to me, I mean, the interesting thing for me was that I came home and my kids came home after this retreat. I came home and my kids were just wanting to hug me, like infinitely. I didn't tell them anything about what I had gone through. They just felt that I was different because there was no longer that question. It was clear from his description of his kid's reaction that S felt that his transpersonal experience had had a real effect on him. I nodded to S to communicate my tacit acceptance of the subjective reality of his encounter and to indicate how remarkable it was that his children, who knew nothing, of course, of this encounter, how remarkable it was that his children could tell that he had changed. So I mentioned earlier that we would return to William James and uh, this terrible moment in his life, the winter of 1869, 1870. So during that winter, in the context of an ailing back, his cousin Minnie Temple's death, and the difficulties he was having settling on a clear career path, William James had sunk into a very deep depression. In this frame of mind, he was startled by a vision. What I'm about to read aloud was published 32 years later, 32 years after this winter, in his most famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it was published as an anecdote that had been related to James by a French correspondent, someone he called a French correspondent. But it was later revealed in a letter that James wrote to the book's French translator that this was actually his own experience, which most William James biographers, as well as his son Henry, place shortly after the death of Minnie Temple, his cousin, in early 1870. So here is the vision that he wrote about in the varieties of religious experience. Though, as I said, when he wrote about it, he said it was not his own experience, but the experience of a French correspondent who had written it to him in a letter. Suddenly, there fell upon me, without any warning, just as if it came out of the darkness, a horrible fear of my own existence. Simultaneously, there arose in my mind the image of an epileptic patient whom I had seen in the asylum, a black-haired youth with greenish skin, entirely idiotic, who used to sit all day on one of the benches, with his knees drawn up against his chin, moving nothing but his black eyes and looking absolutely non-human. This image and my fear entered into a species of combination with each other. That shape am I felt potentially. Nothing that I possess can defend me against that fate, if the hour for it should strike me as it struck for him. There was such a horror of him, and such a perception of my own merely momentary discrepancy from him, that it was as if something hitherto solid within my breast gave way entirely, and I became a mass of quivering fear. After this, the universe was changed for me altogether. I awoke morning after morning with a horrible dread at the pit of my stomach. So William James continues here with comments that Winnicott would undoubtedly have related to the infant's early annihilation. So James says, I remember wondering how other people could live, how I myself had ever lived, so unconscious of that pit of insecurity beneath the surface of life. I mean that the fear was so invasive and powerful that if I had not clung to scripture texts like the eternal God is my refuge, or come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, or I am the resurrection and the life, if I had not clung to those, I think I should have grown really insane. So the reasons that James disguised his own vision as that of some unidentified French correspondent so many years after the fact are open to speculation. I think it must have taken both great suffering and great courage for William James to acknowledge his need to believe in what he most often regarded as an illusion. It's interesting, too, that James turned to an actual French author to support his decision to believe. 6 weeks after the death of Minnie Temple, an entry in one of James's notebooks, dated April 30th, 1870, refers to an actual Frenchman. And here's the entry in his notebook. I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvilier's second essays and see no reason why his definition of free will, Renouvier was a philosopher, why his definition of free will, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to, when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, at least until next year, that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will. I will go a step further with my will, not only act with it, but believe as well, believe in my individual reality and creative power. So whether or not this French philosopher Renouvier inspired in some way this ruse of using a fictional French correspondent in the varieties of religious experience is not known. But it seems likely that the crisis James is referring to is this panic-filled vision of the epileptic patient, which, as he said, changed his universe altogether. Either way, he finds in Renouvier's philosophy an accepting, validating attitude regarding his turn toward faith in a moment of crisis, an authorization, and I quote here, to believe in my individual reality and creative power. So he effectively creates for himself in Renouvier an approach remarkably similar to Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to transitional phenomena. In each of the vignettes, including the William James vignette, the subject experiences the content of his experience is real, notwithstanding a simultaneous knowledge of its impossibility under the normal rules of engagement, so to speak. In each case, the content of the vision resonates in some deep way with a true self, inspiring a powerful belief in its meaningfulness. In this mode of experiencing, which is continuous with what Winnicott describes as, quote, the place where we live, end quote, it hardly matters whether a chain of facts can support the existence of what takes place. A therapist is privileged to have the opportunity to work with such experiences, which creatively embody the key issues in a person's life. As real as these experiences feel, a witness is often needed to ratify their significance. As S said to me, and I quote, for me, it's so amazing that with having a listener, that these experiences, they come to life again. They come back in a very colorful way, very powerful. End quote. Such transpersonal experiences are necessarily ephemeral. Without a knowing listener, their truth dissipates more quickly. S's comment highlights the intersubjective, or what William James called the transpersonal dimension of such experiences. It is in James's my object is your object notion that the paradox of illusion-disillusionment resides. When you understand my experience, it feels more real to me, brings it to life. This is Winnicott's so-called implementation. This experience of the real facilitates the surrender of omnipotence, not because an illusion has been ratified, but because a real gesture, an intention, has been understood. When a real meeting of minds takes place, the need for omnipotence subsides. The door opens for considering others' perspectives. Adopting Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to the transpersonal experiences described in this talk leaves open the question of whether the power of D's and O's shared feelings actually caused the lights to flicker or cured her leg pain, and whether or not S's grandfather actually had pedophilia. One can easily imagine a downside to leaving questions like this untouched. Say, if D or S had insisted, which they didn't, that these encounters reveal historical truths. S has considered investigating whether his grandfather was ever suspected within the family of being a pedophile, but he feels no urgency to do so. Anecdotal reports exist of tragic outcomes of psychedelic-induced beliefs, including an individual who believed she was an angel and jumped out of a window. As with any treatment strategy, sound clinical judgment and risk assessment must take precedence, including assessing the risk of irrational behavior in relation to delusional thinking. In a clear-cut case of delusional thinking, an agnostic approach to psychedelic-induced beliefs may be ill-advised. But to be clear, delusionally held ideas can arise quite independently of the therapeutic approach of the practitioner, and most often arise from psychedelic use in the absence of a practitioner. One reason the illusion-disillusionment approach is less risky than one might think is that most individuals, even many delusional individuals, routinely engaged in what Bloiler termed double entry bookkeeping, whereby context dictates which set of beliefs one acts upon. In general, the advantages of an agnostic approach to transpersonal experiences most often outweigh the risks. And they also speak to the real limits of the psychedelic or other therapists' expertise. We are not arbiters of what is and isn't real. We become much more trustworthy and useful when we practice this way. A kid doesn't need to hear that his teddy bear isn't really alive, but at times he may need someone to help him find it. And that is the end of the slideshow.
Wow, you want to,
Quit sharing.
yeah, yeah.
Yep. Uh, there we go.
Dr. Fishman, thank you for such a thoughtful, inspiring presentation, and such a joy to hear these worlds integrated in such a sensitive way. We have some questions coming in. Everybody out there, please, if you have an ice cream flavor you'd like, put that in. I haven't seen any yet. And also, we have some thoughtful questions already. And so please go ahead and put those in, and we'll get to those. I was wondering, just to start us off, Dr. Fishman, you've talked about in a couple clinical examples, kind of one-time psychedelic experiences. In your experience, is that kind of something that, I don't know, serves like a portal for future psychodynamic work, or psychotherapeutic work, or do your or did your clients continue for multiple experiences, or how do you reckon with that?
Yeah, I think what your question touches on is one of the reasons that the Lykos application for MDMA assisted therapy didn't get approved, meaning that I think the people at the DEA who are making these decisions um, are um, are a little concerned about the possibility that psychedelic therapy is not going to be about a single use or even one, two, or three single uses, but may lead to prolonged use. But the good or continuous use. The good news about that is that that's not the pattern of use of psychedelic substances. It's much different in that respect from sedatives and opiates and so on. Um, People don't tend to use psychedelic drugs over and over again. And in fact, if you were to try to say use LSD 3 days in a row, by the third day it would have almost no effect on you at all. So, what I imagine will happen when and if this is eventually approved as an authorized treatment is that people will discuss either experiences they've had in the past on psychedelics or an experience that is taking place sort of in the here and now with a psychedelic therapist. And then they will have many sessions afterwards in which they allude over and over again to the material raised in that LSD experience. I think it's possible that over time, like let's say maybe once a year, once every 3 years, maybe three times a year, depending on the person and the situation, people will feel inclined or inspired to try doing it again and to see where it leads. But I don't think this is going to be a situation where it's going to happen on a sort of frequent, ongoing basis.
Great. Um, so the question here, psychedelic psychotherapy is not currently available. What do you advise people about that? There's questions here about how would I refer somebody? What's the state of that?
Yeah, so that is the unfortunate reality of our situation now. I think it's unfortunate anyway. So there are two states, Colorado and Oregon, where this is now authorized, and people who are licensed and certified to do this kind of work and their patients can do this work together. That is to take a psychedelic under supervision and discuss it in therapy. Um, and so those remain the only legal ways, legal places in this country where this can be done. It is frequently done outside of this country in places like Australia, Holland, Mexico, and people often travel to retreats in order to have these kinds of experiences. And there is a vast underground, which of course we are not allowed to directly refer people to, but which people honestly don't need our referrals to locate, in which they can find practitioners who are doing this on an underground basis.
Great. Let me turn to a question from Dr. Jonah Teitelbaum. Hello, Jonah out there, and here we go. If the illusion disillusionment process ideally leads to more adaptive beliefs or expectations of the world, how can we square this with the fact that folks undergoing psychedelic experiences often leave with contradictory metaphysical insights, like I finally found myself, my true self versus there is no self, and time is an illusion versus the moment is eternal, especially considering these beliefs do not seem to mediate outcomes. How might this relate to a hallmark characteristic of psychedelic experiences, the noetic quality, the sense that what is encountered in the psychedelic experience is realer than real?
Oh, there's an awful lot in that
Out
question.
there.
Uh, I'm not sure which part of it to respond to. I will say that I think most people, and this is a little bit like what I referred to double entry bookkeeping, uh, what Bloiler meant in referring to this term double entry bookkeeping, that most people recognize the importance and appropriateness of context, and that in their day-to-day life at work, it doesn't seem appropriate or useful to consider that time doesn't really exist, or that the self is a fiction, and that they go about their routine existence in a way that these sort of more profound insights obtained under the influence of psychedelics don't really directly bear. Um, but I think where they do tend to come into play is uh, I'll cite one example. In the end of life, under terminal illness anxiety situation, I think they provide a sense of comfort or a sense of um, uh, existential okayness with the impending idea of death. Uh, and I think that that doesn't really get in the way in any meaningful sense of impairment. So I don't think in practical terms this is going to come into play very often. Now, I did mention this example of someone who thought that they were an angel and jumped out a window. Um, Undoubtedly, there are going to be some individual instances where people um, cling to these beliefs in a very literal and inappropriate way. And in that case, I certainly would not recommend taking an agnostic approach. Obviously, clinical judgment supersedes any guiding rule of therapy.
Great. A question here, Dr. Fishman says, my client and her husband both took psychedelic trips. My client said that her experience was way more difficult because she took MDMA while her spouse took psilocybin. She said the comeback was very harsh. Can you explain this? I don't.
So if I understand the question, the harsher experience was the MDMA experience.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'll start off by saying that that seems to be more an exception than the rule. That comparatively speaking, MDMA has mildly hallucinogenic properties, psychedelic properties, compared to psilocybin. Um, but what it does speak to is the tremendous variability in individuals' experiences with this. And so-called challenging experiences, which mean people who are taking these drugs and having moments of extreme anxiety, panic, are not unusual. And that's why it's important to have some experience in guiding these trips and helping people to get through them. And, often, and this is something that's always discussed ahead of time in terms of consent, sometimes hand holding or, a pat on the shoulder can help get someone through, breathing exercises, stuff that just helps someone get through it, plus being able to convey the benefit of experience of sitting with other people who've been through this and find that these challenging experiences can, in the end, turn out to be very useful and can teach someone something that's important to know about what it is that underlies their occasional terrors. Um, so those experiences can eventually turn out to be among the more helpful psychedelic-assisted therapy experiences.
Question here. Um, does the therapist need to have had a previous psychedelic experience in order to do this therapy well?
Um, so I'll try to answer that in two ways. Um, there will probably never be an insistence within training agencies or institutions that practitioners undergo their own psychedelic experiences. So the legal answer is going to be most likely no. The practical answer is that having undergone experiences like this oneself is extremely valuable and useful in being able to guide and conduct therapy in relation to them.
Great. And question here, are there medical or medication contraindications to psychedelics?
Yeah. So, for example, MDMA, which may, although they had a setback, be the first one to be approved. There are lots of cardiovascular conditions in which MDMA should be avoided because it has sympathetic properties. So, if you're prone to high blood pressure or tachycardia or arrhythmia, you should not take MDMA. That's less true of the classical psychedelics, like psilocybin, which is likely going to be the first classical psychedelic to be approved, or DMT. Um, but there are also psychiatric contraindications. So it's probably not a good idea for people with a history of psychosis to undergo this because there's a chance to have a prolonged psychotic reaction. Um, some people would argue that people with close family histories of either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder may also be at slightly higher risk for having one of these prolonged psychotic reactions. Um, so the answer is yes, there are certain contraindications.
Great, thank you. So here's a great question from Ian Luker, talking about really the intersubjective model, really, and the question about that. He says, thank you for this thoughtful talk. In psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, we emphasize the quote, innate healing capacity of the client, an emphasis placed on trusting the inherent meaningfulness of these experiences and the individual's internal capacity to process non-ordinary states of consciousness. This strikes me as a type of internal holding that empowers the individual. Comments about that idea?
Yeah. Um, Maybe I can put the reference in the chat. I'm not sure, or you could look it up. I recently published a paper about this topic in which I addressed what is this inner healing intelligence? Um, and the title of the paper, if I remember it right, is "My Bad, You Got This." The inner healing intelligence and the role of witnessing in psychedelic therapy. So here's my take on this. I think this model, which is the one used by the MAPS organization and all the research that they've sponsored, I think it's an extremely powerful and effective model. And the idea in this is that in the pre-drug sessions, in the preparatory sessions, you talk about this um, inner healing intelligence as if it's an agency of the mind, in the same way that, in another era, we talked about the ego and the superego and the id. It's an agency of the mind. And to this agency, we attribute a kind of healing capacity. Um, and they often use metaphors like, the body knows how to heal a wound. The role of a physician in treating a wound is simply to clean away the debris, and the body heals itself. So by telling a patient who's about to undergo a psychedelic experience that during this experience you will get in touch, or it will be easier for you to access this inner healing intelligence, you're expressing an abiding faith in the helpfulness of the process. And you're also saying at the same time, it's not any magic or learning or training or ideas that I have that are going to make the difference between you and being able to gain from this experience or to heal from this experience. The power to do so is entirely within you. But in doing that, in saying that, what you're really doing, I think, is creating trust in the therapeutic relationship. So I think the reason that this inner healing intelligence model works is because it's a real way of building the trust that's needed in the therapeutic situation to allow a safe and transformative experience to take place. So it's sort of a twist on it. Do I think the inner healing intelligence really exists as an agency of the mind? Well, only in the same way that an ego does. It's a construct. Um, I don't. I think if we had the power to heal ourselves, we wouldn't need to take psychedelics and go to therapy. So I don't think we can all do it all by ourselves. But by saying that we can, we're influencing something about the relational nature of the treatment.
I see. And by saying that to a client, like if you were to say that to me, there's something almost about trust that's built between me and you, um, by your identifying that part in my mind. There's an intersubjective quality to that experience.
And I think what happens is we were saying, I'm going to stay out of this. You don't most people who are taking MDMA for PTSD have difficulty with trust to begin with. So it's a way of saying, I know there's lots of reasons why it's going to be hard to trust me, especially when you're taking this drug and all your defenses are down. But don't worry about it. All I'm going to do is sit here and support you while your inner healing intelligence takes over and allows this process to unfold.
Mm. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Uh, Matthew Catanelli asks, how do you engage with a client who says they have, quote, gotten nothing from the experience? Like they didn't feel anything or that it was so difficult, and how could that be beneficial? So I guess those are two different ideas.
Yeah, well, so I would say in the same way that you would deal with someone saying that about a therapy session or about an interpretation or an idea. So you might start out by asking, well, or saying, look, I'm sorry that that happened or that you feel that way about it. What were you hoping would happen? What happened instead? Um, you know, how does that disappointment feel to you? Um, do you think that there's anything that could have been done differently that might have affected the outcome? I mean, all the questions that one would ask when someone reports a negative experience of any kind. That is, one assumes that there's something to be learned in this statement that someone is making about this sucked, nothing good came out of it. It was just bad. Okay, well, let's look at it. What happened during that experience? What was bad about it? So I would try to engage that report in a way that can draw something further from it.
Great. Our Dr. Ortiz Schwartz here asks, is there something about the role of neuroplasticity in this inner healing experience of psychedelics? Is it related to that?
Well, yes. So a lot of what is going on now in terms of neurophysiological slash pharmacological slash imaging research with regard to psychedelics is about this concept of neuroplasticity. And so, t t in my mind, the people who've had the most interesting ideas about how psychedelics work are the Carhart-Harris group, who used to be in London at the Imperial College and now is at UCSF. And their idea about how psychedelics work is that they introduce neuroplasticity or brain criticality uh, into someone's experience. So the way to think about criticality is that normally, if let's say, you're looking at a mountain and thinking about how water flows down the mountain, it tends to flow down the crevices, the rivulets that are carved into the side of the mountain. Um, and water will always flow through those same paths. In the same way, our thoughts generally follow very well defined pathways. And what happens in moments of criticality is that the the landscape is flatter. Um, so to speak. So water or thoughts, by extending this metaphor, don't follow along the preordained paths, but can now roam across different pathways. And one way of talking about how psychedelics work is in terms of their causing neuroplasticity in this way.
Got it. So we're just about at the end. Margaret Coffey out there wrote, it was asking about the importance of the preparation for the journey, which you alluded to just a little bit ago. It sounds like you meet with clients before um, engaging in this.
Yeah, so in the kind of situations which I described in this talk, these were people who were talking about experiences they had outside of therapy. But when and if psychedelic-assisted therapy is approved, it is very important to engage in several sessions of getting to know someone. And that's with people you don't know to begin with. I think a better situation will be when people are able to do this with someone they've been in therapy with for a long time. So there's a long preparatory period built up.
Great. And we are at the hour. We have, let me see, amidst the questions, there were a couple for you.
Flavors you're looking for?
Coffee ice cream with white chocolate bites and hazelnuts, as well as
Was
bubble
it chocolate or coffee, did you say?
coffee ice cream with white chocolate bites and hazelnuts.
White chocolate bites and hazel. Okay.
That's from a Martha Cobb. And an anonymous attendee says bubble bursting bubble gum. Remember that as a child, actually bubblegum ice cream.
I appreciate the use of the talk today in developing the flavor.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing the space today, in the name of our transitional phenomenon and being together. Thank you so much for being with us and everybody out there. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining the talk with Dr. Fishman today. And as a reminder for folks wishing to receive continuing education credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in the browser as we end the webinar. And we hope you can join us again on June 11th for our grand rounds with Dr. Gitlin. And after being together, it's a little harsh separating. So I think this is the disillusionment. But it's been
Thanks for
great
having me. It
being
was a
being
pleasure.
with. Yeah,
A lot of
yeah.
fun.
It's great to meet you in person. All right. Thanks everybody for being here and until next time.